What happens when a foolish prank meets centuries of royal discipline? Stay with us, because this real-life moment will leave you stunned and deeply moved. Before we dive in, take a second to subscribe to Guard Royals and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Every click helps us bring you more powerful true stories that honor tradition, character, and sacrifice. Now, imagine a chilly winter morning outside Buckingham Palace. The air was crisp, the sun glinting off frost-covered stones. Tourists clustered behind the gates, drawn to the timeless elegance of the changing of the guard. But what most didn't see was the weight behind the uniform. Sergeant Caleb Whitmore, 34, stood tall in his bearskin hat and crimson tunic. A third-generation soldier, Caleb carried more than a rifle. He bore memories. His father lost in the Falklands, his younger brother fallen in Syria. Before every shift, Caleb pressed a faded photo to his heart, a quiet ritual, unseen by the crowd but deeply sacred. In today's video, you'll see how this silent sentinel faced a public act of disrespect and how he turned that moment into a masterclass in dignity. Like, comment, and watch to the end. You won't believe how it unfolds. It started with a laugh and ended with a gasp. Across the courtyard, 3 American tourists had just arrived from an overnight flight out of Chicago. Among them was Brandon Miller, a 24-year-old content creator whose online persona thrived on chaos. Brandon wasn't new to controversy. His TikTok channel, Viral Blitz, was notorious for public stunts that pushed limits. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to provoke. Brandon squinted through his camera lens, pacing back and forth with restless energy. "We're gonna make history today," he muttered. His goal? To get one of the Queen's guards to react on camera. His friend Tyler Brooks adjusted the microphone, clearly uneasy. "Man, they're soldiers, not props." But Brandon waved him off. The moment they spotted Sergeant Caleb Whitmore standing in perfect stillness, Brandon's eyes lit up. He saw opportunity. "This is the one," he whispered. And with thousands watching live on his stream, Brandon began his approach. In the crowd, older tourists leaned in with concern. A British grandfather visiting with his granddaughter instinctively pulled her closer. Nearby, a retired Marine from Pennsylvania narrowed his eyes. He had seen this posture before. Something wasn't right. Then it happened. With exaggerated swagger, Brandon raised his hand and delivered a light but deliberate smack to the edge of Caleb's bearskin hat. The crowd fell into stunned silence. In that instant, something shifted, not just in the air but in the energy of the place. This wasn't just a prank. It was a line crossed, a moment where spectacle collided with sacred ground. And Sergeant Caleb Whitmore was still as stone, but the weight of his heritage had already begun to stir. For a full second, everything froze. The slap, soft in sound but thunderous in meaning, echoed across the stone courtyard. Brandon Miller stood grinning, his camera angled toward his own face, basking in the spotlight of digital mischief. "Got him!" he exclaimed, raising his phone to capture his own triumphant smirk. But the crowd wasn't laughing. Gasps rippled like shock waves. A young boy in the front row began to cry. His mother immediately shielded his eyes. An elderly couple from Texas stood motionless, their expressions shifting from curiosity to deep offense. And just a few feet away, Sergeant Caleb Whitmore, still as marble, didn't flinch. But inside, he burned. Not with anger, but with history, with memory, with duty. This uniform wasn't just fabric and brass. It carried the weight of sacrifice, of fathers lost, brothers buried, and promises made. Caleb's fingers twitched ever so slightly near the grip of his rifle. A flicker, nothing more, honed by years of combat readiness. Brandon had no idea what he had just touched, but Tyler Brooks did. As soon as Brandon struck the bearskin hat, Tyler's face drained of color. "Dude, no," he whispered, stepping back, his camera arm dropping. Leo Santos, their quietest friend and video editor, slowly lowered his own phone and shook his head. "This is really bad." The live stream's chat exploded. "Not cool. Is that even legal? Dude's gonna get arrested." And they were right. Within moments, Sergeant Whitmore's training kicked in. His right boot pivoted exactly 90 degrees. With seamless precision, he raised his SA-80 rifle across his chest, not as a threat, but as a statement of posture and authority. Then came the thunder. "Guard approaching, clear the ground." The words rang like a cannon through the frigid air. The echo of command vibrated against the palace walls. Startled pigeons scattered from the rooftop. Tourists instinctively parted, stepping back in reverent fear. 2 additional guards emerged from within the palace gate. Corporal Ryan Doyle and Lance Corporal Jack Ellison, both combat veterans like Caleb, moved with synchronized fluidity. Their formation boxed Brandon in from 3 sides. It wasn't hostile, it was majestic. A live tableau of discipline and restraint, centuries in the making. Brandon's smirk faltered. He looked at his phone, only now noticing the flood of angry comments and shocked emojis. His followers were turning. The same platform he hoped would make him a star had become a spotlight on his disgrace. It was a joke," he stammered, looking at Caleb. "Come on, man, for the views." But Caleb didn't respond. He stood tall, eyes locked forward, not on Brandon, but through him, because this wasn't about one foolish man. It was about every soldier who had stood on those stones and never wavered. Every family who had lost someone in silence. Every little boy watching, learning what it means to be a man of honor. From the palace steps, Sergeant Major Thomas Keane, a towering figure with 30 years in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, descended with slow, deliberate authority. The silver crown on his sleeve gleamed in the morning sun as he approached. Security moved in without urgency but without delay. Detective Inspector Grace Holloway, calm and clear, stepped forward with words that would change Brandon's life. "Sir, you are under arrest for assaulting a serving member of the Royal Guard. Please place your phone on the ground." Brandon's hand trembled as he obeyed. The live stream ended with a hard, final click. But what had started as a prank had now become an international lesson in humility, honor, and consequence. The moment the live stream ended, reality hit harder than any comment ever could. Brandon Miller, once confident, now sat handcuffed in the back of a police van parked just outside the palace gates. The cold metal against his wrists had a sobering finality to it. No filters, no edits, no music overlays, just the raw consequence of his action. Through the tinted window, he could still see the faint silhouette of Sergeant Caleb Whitmore, resuming his position with unwavering composure. Brandon stared, strangely transfixed. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about algorithms, likes, or going viral. He was thinking about what it must feel like to wear a uniform that meant something. Inside the palace's small holding area, Detective Inspector Grace Holloway spoke firmly but with a tone that echoed something deeper than duty: disappointment. "Mr. Miller, this isn't a prank gone too far. You didn't just touch a hat. You disrespected a legacy that predates your country's founding." Brandon lowered his head. No witty comebacks, just silence. Meanwhile, across the courtyard, Tyler and Leo were being questioned by security. Tyler, still shaking, wiped his palms on his jeans. "We tried to stop him. I swear, this wasn't supposed to happen." Leo, who hadn't spoken since the incident, whispered something that caught the officer's attention. Doesn't know how to lose attention. He thinks pain is better than silence." Back on duty, Caleb's face remained expressionless, but his heart was anything but calm. Moments earlier, his memories had flooded back. The trembling hand of his mother receiving his brother's final belongings, the solemn funeral with no answers, the years he spent wondering if any of it mattered. Today proved it did. By standing still, by choosing dignity over anger, he had drawn the line, not just for himself, but for all who came before and after. Later that evening, after his shift, Caleb stepped into the quiet of the guard's locker room. He opened his locker and retrieved the photo of his brother, creased, weathered, but still vivid. For the first time in years, he smiled at it. Not a full smile, but a quiet one. A smile that whispered, "You'd be proud." That night, the news went global. Headlines read, "American influencer arrested after assaulting royal guard in Buckingham Palace prank. Sergeant's composure sets internet ablaze with praise." Veterans across the UK and the US shared the clip, calling it the embodiment of discipline. Social media, ironically, became Caleb's unexpected platform. Millions of people rallying around the silent strength he displayed. And as for Brandon, he sat alone in a cold, dim holding cell. But something had shifted. He wasn't angry at the guards. He wasn't angry at the law. He was angry at himself. Angry for thinking tradition was a joke, looking at trauma into content. Angry for never learning the value of restraint. In the corner of the cell sat a small desk with a pen and a notepad. He stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, with trembling hands, he began to write. The notepad in the cell was blank, but in Brandon's mind it screamed with possibilities and regrets. His first words were uneven. "Caleb Whitmore, I'm sorry." He didn't know if the letter would ever reach the man in the crimson tunic, but it didn't matter. For the first time, Brandon was writing not for views, but for clarity, for redemption. Days later, he appeared in court. The trial took place at Westminster Magistrates' Court, under oak-paneled ceilings and centuries of legal tradition. A gray-haired judge, Justice Elizabeth Crawford, listened intently as the Crown prosecutor laid out the case. Video evidence, public reaction, eyewitness accounts. It was all undeniable. But so was Brandon's remorse. In a surprising moment, he stood to speak. "Your Honor, I thought the scariest thing was being ignored on the internet. I was wrong. The scariest thing is realizing you've become the villain in someone else's life. Someone who didn't deserve it." The room fell silent. Even the court reporters paused their typing. Justice Crawford didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Mr. Miller, this court does not exist to ruin lives. It exists to protect dignity. You crossed a sacred line, but you've also shown a willingness to walk it back." The sentence was firm, but redemptive. A $10,000 0-cent fine. 400 hours of community service, specifically at the Royal Army Museum, assisting veterans and school children on guided tours. And a 6-year ban from re-entering the United Kingdom. At first, the punishment stung, but in time it became the greatest blessing Brandon never asked for. At the museum, Brandon found himself face to face with artifacts that told the stories of real men. Men who had bled, fought, and died for causes bigger than themselves. One display in particular changed him forever. It featured a worn bearskin hat and a folded note beneath it. "In honor of certain Thomas Whitmore, Falklands, 1982. We stand so others may rest." Brandon stared for what felt like an hour. Whitmore, that name, wasn't just Caleb's present, it was his past. That's when Brandon finally understood what he had disrespected. Not just a man, not even just a tradition, but a lineage of sacrifice. From that moment on, his community service became something more. He stayed late. He listened to veterans. He helped school kids understand what honor really meant. And without fanfare or followers, he began to rebuild himself. 6 months later, Brandon returned to YouTube, but not as the old him. Gone were the prank thumbnails and shouting titles. His new channel was called Honor Abroad. The first video was titled, "I Was Wrong," a public apology to the Queen's Guard. He didn't use dramatic music, just one camera, one take, and one voice, sincere and steady. He spoke of Caleb Whitmore, of his arrest, of what it meant to see a man stand still and teach the world something no viral video ever could. The video went viral, not out of outrage, but out of respect. And in a rare, quiet moment months later, Caleb sat in the guards' quarters, opened his email, and found the video link. He watched it all the way through. At the end, he nodded once. No reply, no public comment. Just a quiet sense that perhaps the world still had room for grace. Brandon Miller didn't become a better man overnight. Redemption isn't a viral moment. It's a quiet daily commitment, and some days it hurts. The first few weeks of community service at the Royal Army Museum were humbling. Brandon scrubbed floors, packed pamphlets, and refilled water pitchers during lectures he didn't understand at first. He avoided eye contact. The staff recognized him. Some nodded politely, others offered nothing but silence. It was the kind of silence that carried judgment. But judgment wasn't what broke him. What broke him was connection. One Thursday afternoon, while organizing the library archive, an elderly veteran named Walter Briggs pulled up beside him with a cane and a folder full of memories. "You're the prank kid," the man said plainly. Brandon froze. He nodded. Walter didn't scold. He didn't shame. He just opened the folder and pointed to a photo. "That's my brother. Died at Arnhem in '44. The man who guarded his coffin wore that same red tunic. You disrespected them all, son, but you're here now. So tell me, what are you going to do with that?" Brennan didn't answer that day, but he came back early the next morning, and the one after that, and then something changed. He began reading the letters behind the glass displays. Messages from soldiers to their families, some scribbled minutes before battle. He learned names, dates, stories. He began assisting with school groups and veterans events, slowly becoming more than just the guy who messed up. In one presentation, a middle schooler asked him, "Are you the guy from the guard video?" Brandon paused, then smiled faintly. "I was, but I'm trying to be someone better now." That answer stuck. Meanwhile, his YouTube channel Honor Abroad began to gain quiet traction. Not millions of views, but thousands of meaningful ones. Veterans commented. Parents shared his videos with their kids. Tour guides used clips in training sessions. One series became particularly beloved. Traditions Worth Protecting. Short vignettes about cultural respect, featuring interviews with guards, soldiers, and locals from different countries. He wasn't just visiting places anymore, he was learning them. The public perception of Brandon shifted, not because he asked for forgiveness, but because he showed it. Back in the US, his parents, who had once blocked his content feeds, reached out. "We saw your video with the WWR vet," his mother wrote. "Your grandfather would have been proud." That message brought him to tears. Not because he'd earned praise, but because he had finally earned peace. But even with all this growth, Brandon knew some wounds would never fully close. He would never walk the stones of Buckingham Palace again. He would never shake Sergeant Caleb Whitmore's hand. But maybe that was the point. Some of the most important transformations happen far from recognition. In silence, in service, in... Brandon once thought influence meant having 1 million followers. Now he knew influence was how one moment could shape a stranger's life. In one of his final community shifts, as he packed up a display case for restoration, he found a quote inscribed behind the frame. It wasn't attributed to anyone. It simply read, "Respect isn't demanded, it's reflected." Brandon read it again, and then whispered under his breath, "Yeah, that's it." It was almost a year to the day since the incident outside Buckingham Palace. A cold morning in February, the same golden gates, the same scarlet uniforms, the same quiet reverence in the air, but something had changed. Far beyond the courtyard, Sergeant Caleb Whitmore stood in position once more, unmoved as the crowd gathered. Yet today there was something different in his eyes. Calm, yes, but reflective, measured. He had seen the video, not just the apology, but the transformation. And though he never commented publicly, word had reached him through whispers in the ranks, museum docents, and a handwritten letter delivered months earlier, sealed, respectful, and humble. He kept that letter, not for ego, not for pride, but because it reminded him that grace, too, is part of duty. Halfway across the Atlantic, Brandon Miller now spoke to schools, veterans halls, and digital creators about what happened that day, not to glorify the mistake, but to illuminate the lesson. He often opened with a line that startled people. "I thought disrespect would get me noticed, but respect is what gave me purpose." In one of his most viewed videos to date, he sat beside Walter Briggs, the veteran who had once quietly asked, "What are you going to do with that?" Brandon looked into the camera and said, "I'm still answering that question." The story of what happened at Buckingham Palace didn't fade like most viral content. It became something else, a turning point, a case study, a teaching tool, a modern parable in classrooms, military training sessions, and even in marketing seminars about the ethics of attention. But most of all, it became a conversation about boundaries, about reverence, about second chances. And perhaps most importantly, for millions who watched it unfold, it reminded them that standing still can sometimes be the strongest move of all. One day, while Brandon was filming an episode in Washington, D.C., he stopped at the tomb of the unknown soldier. He stood in silence for nearly 30 minutes, unnoticed by the crowd, no camera rolling. Just him, at peace with not being seen. When a group of school children nearby began talking loudly, he gently turned and raised a finger to his lips. Not with anger, with reverence. They quieted. And for a moment, he wasn't the guy from that video anymore. He was simply a man who had learned. Meanwhile, Sergeant Caleb Whitmore continued his service, not for fame, not for recognition, but because duty is quieter than applause. And though he would never publicly accept praise, a small token sat folded in the corner of his locker, a signed postcard from Brandon with just 5 words written in careful script. "You taught me to stand." This story is more than a headline. It's a reminder that even in a noisy world, stillness has power. And sometimes, the greatest act of strength is choosing dignity when no one expects it. Now let me ask you something personal. If you were standing in Sergeant Caleb Whitmore's place that day, still stoic, bearing the full weight of tradition and memory, how would you have reacted? Would you have flinched, raised your voice, broken formation? Or would you have stood firm, holding back every emotion, trusting that dignity speaks louder than retaliation? That moment wasn't just about military discipline. It was a masterclass in emotional restraint, historical awareness, and human grace. Caleb chose to honor not just the rules of his post, but the legacy of his family, his fallen brother, and every soldier who had once worn that same red tunic. And that, dear viewers, is a lesson for all of us. In a world where the loudest voice often gets the most attention, it takes a rare kind of strength to remain silent. In today's fast-paced, reaction-driven society, we're constantly pushed to respond, clap back, make a scene. But what happens when we choose stillness instead of chaos? What happens when we choose discipline over ego? Sometimes, the greatest power lies in not reacting at all. That's not just a military virtue, it's a life skill. A marriage saver, a family strengthener, a legacy builder. Let this story be a reminder. Respect isn't old-fashioned, it's timeless. Self-control isn't weakness, it's leadership. And second chances, they're earned, not demanded. So if life ever puts you in a situation where you feel provoked, pushed, or disrespected, remember Sergeant Whitmore. Remember the strength in restraint, the beauty in honor, and the quiet thunder of doing the right thing, even when the world's watching, because you never know who's learning from your silence. Now we'd love to hear from you. If you were in Caleb's shoes, what would you have done? Be honest. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're here, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel Guard Royals, and help us reach our next goal, 10,000 subscribers who believe that stories like this deserve to be told and remembered. Comment below. On a scale of 1 to 10, how powerful was this story for you and why? Let's start a conversation that brings back the values we were raised on: honor, humility, and heart. And as always, stay respectful, stay thoughtful, stay grounded. We'll see you in the next story.